is really getting houses of worship to understand that physical security 101 is protection of your perimeter. Once your perimeter has been breached, it is very difficult then to keep harm at bay. And when we saw that at the Covenant school in Nashville, where the assailant shot through the glass, and I think within 12 seconds, the assailant was inside the school. So protection of your perimeter for anyone listening in the house of worship that is physical security 101. We've got to find ways to keep harm out.
And welcome to the Firearms Nation podcast. And I used to say welcome back to the Firearms Nation podcast, but maybe you're a new viewer or a new listener, depending if you're watching the video or the audio. So let's just say welcome. And considering my guest, let's just say cheers. My guest tonight is a former detective and officer, and I don't know the exact terminology, and we'll get into it, with the Metropolitan Police Department in London, or I should say in England. You know, my geography is good, but I don't know the correct ways to say things. So we'll get clarifications. But he spent many times there. He's been involved in some serious investigations in organized crime and counterterrorism. He also, when he moved to America, took on a position as the head of counterterrorism at the Mall of America, which we'll get into, which is fascinating. That thing is pretty much a city unto itself. And he's very big in church security. And considering what happened this week, I was actually looking forward to having this discussion with him. So without further ado, let me bring on my guest, Simon. And oh, by the way, his company is Kingswood Security Consulting. But it's Simon Osamoh. That's Osamoh. Did I say it right? Osamoh?
No, you nailed it the first time. Osamoh,
the first time, Osamoh.
Three syllables.
Okay.
You nailed it, yeah. Well,
so Simon,
thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me on your show. And I think you're going to start speaking more Cockney now you're talking to me, maybe. You're going to get a London accent.
Well, I brought out tea instead of coffee tonight just for you.
Well, here's something very embarrassing. I've lived in the US now for coming up to 12 years. And normally when I go anywhere, I have some emergency tea that I keep in my car, because it's very common. I go to a restaurant and I say, do you have some Earl Grey tea with some milk and sugar? And they look at me like I'm an alien. So I've known to bring some of my own tea with me.
Well, the Firearms Nation podcast is definitely worldwide, because, when we look at the charts of who's listening to it, it is all over the world. But I've had on guests from Australia. I've had on guests from South Africa. I've actually, you're not the first Brit. Ian Harrison from Recoil Magazine was on the show before. So he is also a expatriate, I should say. Is that the correct term, expatriate, when you...
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, technically, I'm classed as a British American now. I think that's what I said. But when I became an American citizen, the judge said, Simon, don't let anyone tell you any different. You're just an American citizen. So, but for me, I'd lived in England for 33 years. I'd always be a little bit of me would always be British, even though I am an American.
And so again, forgive me for the way. So when you served. And we discussed it, the Met, which is the Metropolitan Police Department. And before we go any further than that, so it used to be called Scotland Yard, right? Or Scotland Yard, just specifically the Detective Bureau?
No, so actually Scotland Yard was the name of like the station, you might say, and it really sort of just got that nickname, which sort of stuck. So Scotland Yard is sort of the station, if you like, but the sort of Metropolitan Police is the police department, and which I think in the UK now there's a few different investigative agencies, but there's only around 45 investigative agencies in the UK that govern around 65, 70 million people. So, big difference between how the US is set up and how law enforcement is set up in the UK. You're a lot bigger. You have a lot more resources, that's for sure.
Well, that's one of the things I do want to talk a lot about. And if this is boring to you guys, then tune out, but actually don't tune out, because it's fascinating, because there's a big difference between law enforcement, even though we're based off of, the English way of doing policing. And that brings up another question, and maybe you can get the answer. So I know of 3 different versions of what cop means, right? So everyone says, "Oh, you're a cop." Technically, in the United States, we refer to ourselves as police officers, but we go by cop. Fine, it's a cop car. You're a cop. So I've heard these. I've heard that cop is constable on patrol because the first form, like we have police officer, the first form of officer in the Met would be a copper, not a copper, a constable. I've heard copper for the brass on, or the whatever on the badge, they call that a copper, or no, on the buttons. That's what it was, on the buttons.
Yeah.
And then the third one, which I really didn't know that much about, was it came from sort of Latin for capture. It's like capture or whatever, and they made it cop. So which is it?
Well, interestingly, there's most probably an alternative there as well, is that a lot of people in the UK, when they see the police, they call them, there's the old Bill. And that dates back to, I'm trying to remember when the British law enforcement started in the 1800s. And people say the old Bill because I believe that one of the first police officers was called Bill, William. Maybe he was old, I don't know, but the most common term in the UK for a police officer outside of constable is most probably the old Bill. There's the old Bill, or the old Bill are after me. So, and like I said, I think that comes from going back to the 1800s as one of the first police officers. That sort of nickname of that individual really stuck, and that is most probably is what is most well known. Yeah.
But do you know where cop comes from? Do they?
No, I don't know. I mean, I think it's copper. So copper is an abbreviation of copper, and so again, that's another term widely used in the UK to call someone a copper. And I think you must be right. Maybe it did come from the brass on the bottom of the old-fashioned tunic that people have. And actually, we're not in my office. I'm not in my office now. I'm in my podcast studio, but I've got my old police tunic that I used to wear to court with the sort of the brass buttons and stuff is all sort of framed on display. So I imagine it maybe did come from the button somewhere, because all these things are, I think the US is maybe the same. There's a lot of nicknames associated with the police, a lot of bad nicknames as well, but I think that's where it comes from.
Growing up, we always heard the term Bobby for...
Correct, yes.
Is that just a regular officer, or...
Yeah, so a Bobby is generally like a sort of, again, I'm going to have to try and convert the slang, but a Bobby is a constable, which is a police officer, which in the US would most commonly be like your street cop. And again, a Bobby is generally someone that would walk around on the street, in American terms, maybe a community police officer. So someone that would be seen walking around a sort of street, or as we say in England, a patch. You have a patch that you're responsible for. So that's where that's sort of what a Bobby is. But again, even if you said to someone in the US, you've got a patch, I don't know if that's a particular US law enforcement term, but if you said someone in the UK, that police officer's got his patch, they would associate that with an area that he's responsible for. So you've got all these different unique nicknames. And in England, we're a bit weird. We have like 4 or 5 different versions of something, and depending on who you're talking to, you can interchange the language.
Okay, so while we're still going down this route, another misconception, or maybe another perception, I should say, the correct terminology. I feel like I'm talking with someone British that I need to speak more proper.
I told you it was going to happen. You'll start speaking more English.
So that back in the day, most of the cops, or the coppers, do not carry firearms. And to most American law enforcement, that is just something completely unheard of and crazy. But is that still true to today, that most of them are unarmed?
Yeah. Correct, that is still true. So, I mean, I joined the police, very different than in the US. I joined the police when I was 19. I was a detective when I was 23, doing organised crime in my mid-20s, and I moved here to US just short of 34. So I served 14 years and investigated a lot of large drug sort of cartels, you might say, in the US, did a lot of organised crime investigations, did some terrorism work. And as a police officer, as a detective, I think I saw 3 or 4 firearms, One was in someone's like linen closet where they kept like their towels and their bed linen. One was buried in someone's yard. And then I think one was sort of found in someone's house, and I can't remember where the other one was found. It is very unusual to come across a firearm, even within organised crime. And here's part of the reasons why, is that within the 80s, because, again, the political climate is a bit different in the UK than what it is in the US. When we had a couple of school shootings in the 80s, straight away, boom, that was it. Firearms were outlawed. You can have sort of hunting rifles, you can have shotguns, and you can have a few other sort of antique weapons on license. But when we had a lot of active shooters or mass shooters back in the day in the 80s, all firearms were outlawed. So you do find a lot of organised criminals that have firearms, but most of those are for enforcement against other criminals and other individuals. So I'm not saying that as a police officer, police officers don't get shot or don't come across firearms. Of course they do. But most often the mindset is, you're just going into a situation where there isn't going to be a firearm because guns are outlawed, and primarily they're used as enforcement against other criminals. But you do, police officers do get shot, they do get injured in the UK, but it's far and few between.
Now, do the coppers carry non-lethal weapons like tasers or spray?
Yeah, and so how we do it in the UK, so what a lot of the officers now have similar here to in the US, but in the US they have tasers. We would have like CS spray, which is like a sort of pepper spray. You have the sort of the old-fashioned PR-24, the sort of Rodney King type stuff. It moved on to the ASP just before I left. But then you get Roman police officers. So there's more officers that are being armed, but routinely not every officer is armed. And then you have what we call ARVs, armed response vehicles, which are constantly roaming. And they are the ones that will respond if you feel there could be a firearm involved, which to an American is bizarre, right? But I think there could be a gun in this situation, so I'm going to call our armed response vehicle when it's too late if they get there, and so that's a strange mentality. And then when we would do surveillance on individuals, if we thought there was a risk of firearms, then we would have one of our armed response vehicles would come in our surveillance convoy, and we could use them if needs be. So there are people that are armed, but they're roaming, and you call them in when you need them, or they get sent to those calls where a gun has been seen or someone's using sort of increased violence.
Okay, yeah, those are AFOs, right? Armed firearms officers. Is that what it stands for?
Correct. Yes. So armed firearms officers, and generally they're called ARVs. They're in armored response vehicles. So most often the internal jargon would just be, "I need an ARV," but they're firearms officers. Correct.
So who gets to become AFO? How do you become an AFO?
Well, and that's interesting because when I was 22, that was the path that I wanted to take. So in the UK, because we only have sort of 44, like I said, I think there's 44, 45 investigative agencies now in the UK. And within my police department, I had thousands upon thousands of officers. You have to sort of choose or apply to go in a certain direction. So at one point, I wanted to go the firearms route, and actually there was a senior officer that said, "Simon, I think you'd be better served as a detective rather on the firearms team." So I'm not too sure how it works in the US, but you would actually say, "I want to apply for this position." You would go through testing, you would go through the sort of firearms assessment, and then if you're successful, then you would be sort of given a conditional offer to go and join the firearms team. That's pretty much how it works. But you look at your career and say, where is it that I want to go? And you apply for these different specializations.
Well, in America, from my experience, you do apply. So say you want to become a detective, you apply to that, and they'll look at how you handle reports, how you talk in the interview,
Yes.
how what's your knowledge of the skill set. Like say if you're going to narcotics, do you know the narcotics law? How many, they'll look at your record, your arrests. But then also a lot of it is who you know. I'll be honest with that.
Yes, yeah.
They know ahead of time who they want. They'll know somebody, or a supervisor will have worked with that person before and say, "Listen, I want you to come to this unit and let's put your application in just so it's official, but we want you." So I guess that that can go anywhere. And then if you need the training, they'll put you through the training. But so you did say something. So you said UK. So that's the proper way of saying it. You don't say you worked in London. You don't say you worked for the British. You worked in the UK.
Yeah, and again, there's so many different things that you can say there. So you've got it's fascinating. I mean, and I've learned and studied more since I've come to the US. But you've got England, then you've got Wales, and then you've got Scotland and Northern Ireland. The United Kingdom, is a wider, a different way of saying Great Britain, because the United Kingdom includes like Northern Ireland. Whereas, sort of Great Britain excludes Northern Ireland. So there's so many different ways that you can really say it. It comes down to the history and the ancestry. But yes, you've got the United Kingdom, which includes Northern Ireland. You've got Great Britain, and then you've just got England as a whole. So it can become very difficult when you're trying to articulate to someone the sort of the nuances between the difference.
And so you were a detective, but again, since you didn't go the AFO route, so as a detective, and we'll probably get into what you were investigating, but you weren't armed at all?
No. So, I mean, most often, if I'm being very honest, similar to people that are watching the video podcast, and if you're not watching the video podcast, go and check it out. I would wear similar stuff to what I'm wearing now. If I was doing surveillance, I'd be wearing like a sweatshirt, jeans, a pair of tennis shoes or shoes. And if I was going out to do some investigations, I might wear a suit or a tie. At the very least, I would wear a shirt and tie. Most often, if I'm honest, I didn't even take my ASP with me. I'd take my radio so I could get hold of dispatch. But again, it's just a really different way of looking at it. I often say to my wife in the UK, we police by consent. And my wife says, well, what do you mean by that? It's like, well, we sort of have these conversations. We talk to someone, and there is a little bit of an old-fashioned, yes, it's changing for sure. And I think law enforcement across the world is changing. But there's this still old-fashioned collar that, I've got you. And when they come in, we would arrest organised criminals that are importing cocaine, millions of dollars of cocaine into the UK. We'd go around the house and arrest them, and they would either just walk themselves to our police vehicle, or they would just put their hands behind the back, and we'd put the handcuffs on, and then we'd take them to the police station, give them a cup of tea, they have a cigarette, and we'd start having a conversation about our evidence. And the game for them was they'd either go no comment and wouldn't say anything, or we'd disclose, we've done an undercover operation, your house has been bugged, your phone's been tapped, we've got all this evidence, what is it you're going to say? And it was just old-fashioned gentleman conversations. It was, now living in the US, it's unique because it doesn't really happen like that. But in the UK, it's very, very common. But people would just say, okay, you've got me. There's no fighting and rolling around on the street. Yes, it does happen. But most often my experience was that we sort of police by consent, and you get this rapport, you have these conversations with these people, and they just walk themselves to the station and go through the formalities.
When you were working in this environment, let me just ask you, because I am obviously Netflix and Amazon, and I have BritBox and Acorn, and I watch all these TV shows.
Yeah. Luther, do you watch Luther with Idris Elba?
No, I haven't watched that.
Oh, you need to watch that one. That's a good show.
Okay, because I loved Bodyguard, and if you haven't watched Bodyguard, people, that's a great show, and that's on Netflix. But I am fascinated by Line of Duty. I don't know if you saw Line of Duty.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
AC-12, which is anti-corruption, which for us, that would be internal affairs or public corruption, depending on your department. How close to what it's like in the UK is that show?
I mean, there's plagiarism, like there's a lot of things in life. But I can actually give you a real life example, and this is a story for another day, because we could do it in podcast just on this entire episode. But there's someone incarcerated for 5 years back in 2003 that when I moved to the US, I reached out to him, and me and him have actually become friends. He's sort of reformed and out of prison, but that's a podcast episode for another day as to how I became friends with someone I put in prison for 5 years. But during that investigation of him, he would disclose things to me that showed that he knew about my personal life. And I can remember this one particular day when he told me about the train that I got. He asked me why I went a particular route to work, He told me about an apartment that I just purchased that hadn't even, I'm not too sure what you'd say on the US. In the UK, it's land registry. I forget here in the US. I mean, there was no, the title wasn't even in my name. And he was telling me that that I owned this property. And I can remember I interviewed him and I went up to our detective floor and there was like 30 or 40 detectives in there. And I can remember looking around thinking, someone in here has most probably told him that information, because I can't work out how he knows such personal information about me without someone in here telling him. And that was a real strange feeling to have, not knowing who you could trust. So Line of Duty, yes, is plagiarized, but yeah, I mean, there's police corruption in every country, and I'd most probably say in the UK, maybe it's a little bit more sophisticated than in other organisations, but it definitely does occur. I mean, did I see some stuff directly? Well, no, because I mean, you know, you've got to be on the inside for someone to trust you. But there's definitely moments where I heard and saw stuff, and I was thinking, yeah, that doesn't seem quite right. So plagiarised, but I think based off some reality for sure.
You became a police officer at a young age from my
19
research.
19.
Why did you become a police officer or a cop?
You know, a copper. It's good. Yeah, I'm going to get you talking English by the end of it. You're going by the end of this podcast, you're going to call me mate. So that's my goal. You know, it's very strange. So, I mean, part of my background, just getting a bit sort of personal for a moment. My parents separated before I was born. My mum never remarried, so I never had a sort of father figure in my life, and sort of always sort of longed for the validation of a father that sort of never came. And I was around sort of 14, 15, you know, you see a lot of these police shows on sort of TV. And I thought that might be an interesting career. And it's really weird that I was, for whatever reason, when I was 18, I applied for the police. I still don't truly know why I applied for the police. And then every time I was working in social care, I used to work with adults with learning disabilities, Down syndrome, in the community. And the house next door, we were sort of living in a community house supporting these adults. And the house next door was a police inspector who, for your listeners, is a senior officer within the police. And he was talking to me as an 18-year-old kid, and he said, you know, Simon, you know, what are you going to do with your life? What's your sort of goal? And I said, well, I don't know. I've applied for the police. I feel like I might be quite good at it. And he said, well, as you mentioned earlier about who you know, he said, well, my office is next door to the recruitment. Let me take a look and see where your application is. And within 3 days, I don't know what he said, but I had a letter come back saying, you know, your application has been accepted, come in for testing. And there was a series of events very early on in my career as to how I actually became a detective. There was another gentleman called Melvin Young. When I applied for the firearms, he was a chief superintendent, which is incredibly high ranking in the British police. And he called me into his office and said, Simon, I can approve your application for the firearms team, but I think that your skills and gifts would serve you better as a detective. And I can remember saying, well, with respect, sir, I want to go on the firearms team. And then a couple of weeks passed, and then my boss said to me, Simon said, you know, I've been told that you haven't applied. I said, no, I haven't applied. And he said, you didn't get it, Simon, did you? And I said, no, what did I miss? He said, no, he wasn't asking you to apply. He was telling you to apply. It was a series of events really between like 15 years old and my early 20s where other men saw things in me that I didn't see in myself, and that really shaped my life and then my career. So it was most a bit of a, maybe not a default, but ended up in the police, but it was most probably where, for sure, my purpose really is to be in the police. And like I said, I had a series of men that sort of helped guide me, and they sort of filled that void of the father that I never had. Is okay, gee, I see now that he saw something in me I didn't see in myself. So when I see things in other people that they might not see, I now take it as I need to share with that person. Do you realise that you're good at this? Do you realise that you've got a skill here? Do you realise that you might want to consider this? So it was definitely a blessing for me joining the police so young. It shaped really who I then went on to become as a man.
Well, I know you're a spiritual person, and I am as well. Sometimes I think these things happen, obviously it's cliche to say, but happen for a reason. But
Absolutely.
when certain people come into your life and make changes, and you might have a plan on where you things are going, but this person is pushing you in a certain place, and you end up doing it regardless of it's where you wanted to go, but it turns out that's where you're supposed to go. So
Yeah,
that's
absolutely. Yeah. And I think I was in my 14 years in the British police. I mean, you know the size of my police department. I think I was commended by the chief of police on 8 or 9 occasions, which, you know, a couple of my friends spoke at my leaving do. I mean, that's unheard of. But those, I wouldn't have had those accolades when I worked on those cases had I not become a detective, you know. And I found a real gift, as I sort of mentioned about, you know, because of my upbringing, of having an absent father, because of sort of being raised in very poor circumstances, I never disrespected anyone that I arrested. I never looked down on anyone that I arrested. I very much had the attitude of, there but for the grace of God go I. But a different turn when I was 15, messing around with my friends, I could have been the person that's been arrested, my life's changed. I could have been the person that, you know, didn't have anything, and I saw all these people having all these possessions, all these monies, going on these school trips, having all this stuff, and I choose the path. Well, maybe I could just steal that to do it. So I think part of my success was that I treated everyone as I'd want to be treated myself, and just gave them respect and said, you know, they're here because of circumstances, but there but for the grace of God go I. Different turn, I could have been them very easily.
Well, I know one of your biggest cases that you worked on was the 2006 transatlantic aircraft plot, where several terrorists wanted to basically put together bombs on planes going to America and going to Canada to actually blow up the planes. I know you're restricted in some of the stuff you can talk about, but what you can talk about, what was that case like?
You know, and it was interesting. I mean, I'm a hoarder of possessions and belongings, and I've still got a lot of maybe things I shouldn't have. Maybe too many people in the UK listen to this. I've got some old case papers and various different things. But, you know, I look at what we call in England our pocket notebook. I'm not too sure what a US detective would call it, but it's where you write a lot of your notes for cases and stuff in. And I think that investigation happened really quickly. I can remember it was sort of, I called to a hotel by my senior leader and saying, you know, we've got this a case which is evolving and we've got to move very quickly, and we're doing 24-hour surveillance. And I look back at my notes, and I think in like a 14-day period, I was working like 21, 22 hours a day. And I look back now, it's a bit like any parent that's listening to this. You wonder, how did I even get through doing all these hours to survive and to function? And it was a really interesting case to work on, because it was one of the first times in the UK, sort of post 9/11, where everyone created this terrorism legislation, and most often the security services, MI5 and MI6, because they're intelligence based, they're normally stopping these sort of criminals, these terrorists, before they get to the point of action, because, you know, a lot of people don't understand that MI5 and MI6 are like your CIA, they're intelligence based. And it was one of the first occasions that in the UK, at a very senior level, someone made a decision, well, actually, we're not just going to stop this plot, we're going to let it get to the point where they can actually execute. Then we're going to arrest them just at the point when they're about to, you know, to cause this harm, which in the modern era is a very, very, very brave call for some senior leader to make. So it was one of the first times that our sort of terrorism laws post 9/11 were really used and tested to actually take, and in what would have been an intelligence, let's stop, to actually, well, let's let them do enough so we can gather the evidence, and we intend to arrest and prosecute. So I know, I mean, I was very low down the sort of totem pole, but I know that the American side was saying, well, just give them to us, let's just stop this. And the British side were actually said, no, we intend to let them run with this a little bit, and then we're going to arrest them, and we intend to prosecute them. So I think it was one of the first times in the UK that a very brave decision was made by a very senior ranking officer to prosecute, and I think it was a good call. So it was an interesting case to work on. Obviously, it changed my profile as to who I am here in the US, and it was interesting doing surveillance on these individuals, because most often when you're doing organized crime, when you're doing phone tap, when you're doing sort of covert entries to people's houses, into their cars, when you're doing surveillance, you're doing those over an extended period of time. So if we would investigate an organized criminal, we might do a 12, 18-month investigation on them. So we're seeing them on multiple occasions doing certain acts, whereas on this particular case, we had like 2 weeks to do a lot of tactics that would generally take time to develop and grow. So we're under sort of a lot of pressure to do things in a short amount of time, where ordinarily we'd have never done that. So it was a lot of learning, a lot of interesting things. It does show what you can achieve under pressure, for sure.
Now, in the UK, they have a huge network of cameras that basically put everybody under somewhat passive surveillance. What are your thoughts on that? In America, it's a little bit different. In some of the major cities, they have it. But I know America tends to feel like we're more free in certain aspects, and especially when it comes to privacy. So I'm just curious what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, and it's, maybe I'm going to get not political here, but I might say something that some people don't necessarily agree with. So the UK judicial system is based on the fact that there are bad people doing bad things within our society, and we use law enforcement to investigate, to find those bad people, to bring them to justice, and ultimately, to put them in prison. So a lot of our legislation is designed to help us as police officers do those certain things. As an example, one of the laws in the United Kingdom is called Section 32 under the Police Act of 1982, where you can arrest someone and then you can search where they were at the time of the arrest, and then you can search where they were immediately before the arrest. So I see you walk outside of your house, you go to your car drives half a mile down the road, I stop you, I arrest you, I can search your car, I can go back to your house, and under Section 32, I can search your house. So in America, someone would say, well, those two events aren't connected. Well, they are connected because that was the last place that you came. So a lot of our legislation is designed to really help law enforcement, because I still believe we've got one of the most ethical, highly trained police departments in the world. Our laws are designed to help people to be effective. A lot of our phone tap legislation, a lot of our covert entries, the chief of police can authorize those. We don't need to go to court to get a warrant and all this bureaucracy, because that slows it down. It makes it difficult for law enforcement to do their job. So I think when I hear about cameras, we would do covert entries. We'd put a listening device in someone's house, and there could be sex, there could be intimacy. We would just still record, but we would then just not monitor that conversation. We might turn on every 10, 15 minutes to see if they're still in a sexual act. And that, in a way, is protecting their rights, that's protecting their privacy, but we still need to monitor their home, because we're trying to work out, are they involved in this drug conspiracy? And I think it's maybe just a different mindset that a lot of Americans have, because we're born and raised around this UK judicial system. But there's more maybe of an acceptance of privacy, but the collateral intrusion that people talk about, I would
remember,
say...
remember this, my UK friend, we wanted to get away from illegal search and seizure from the British. And
yes.
One of the things when we did with the Constitution is it came with the Fourth Amendment, which stopped that.
Yeah.
So...
yes, so then the problem is, when Americans say to me, oh, there's too much murder. I mean, in the US, there's 17 homicides, 17,000 homicides every year in the US. There's been 188 mass shootings since 1966. So we put things in context, but they're worried about these things, they're challenged about these things, but they don't want their rights to be changed. So it is, like I said, it is a mindset when you're born and raised. I mean, being in the UK, our healthcare isn't brilliant, yes, but we have social healthcare where you walk into hospital, you're treated. In America, you pay insurance, and we have great healthcare. However, from living for 12 years in the US, we're paying more than what we are in the UK. We just don't understand the different systems. So it is a little bit, I don't want to upset your listeners, but it is, you can't have your cake and eat it out. I mean, that's where we've got to find. I mean, when people, they don't want rapes, they don't want murders, they don't want assaults, they don't want active violence in their schools. Well, to find those individuals, the law has to be in the law enforcement's favour to be able to try and apprehend those individuals. And when that's in the US, that's where there's a clash. And I don't know why we don't have as much clash in the UK, but there maybe there's more respect for law enforcement. I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think thinking about what you were saying and thinking about some of the stuff of the way people act in society in the UK versus the mindset of people. I mean, it's a definite, the whole stiff upper lip and the way you appear.
And that is true. That very much is true. It's like, stop complaining and get on with it. I mean, I was 19 when I went to an attempted murder where a woman died in my arms. 19 years old. It was the one and only time when I couldn't sleep at night. I went back to the police station, and the detective sergeant, I was sort of, had a tear in my eye and was sort of getting my thoughts. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm just having a moment." He said, "Get out there, effing Osamoh. There's more people that need saving." And he kicked me out on the street within 30 minutes of a woman dying in my arms that was murdered by her husband. And that stiff upper lip, as in stop complaining and move forward. I think that is part of Britain. I mean, that was what Winston Churchill instilled in the country. We'll fight them on the beaches, we'll never surrender. It is very true.
And I'll say this too. I mean, there's such a connection between England and the United States that a lot of people don't even understand. But from our laws and from a lot of our customs and stuff, there is a big connection. So nothing's perfect. I think both systems work in different ways. But there are pros and cons. Personally, from my perspective, I think more cameras are better because then it just makes my job easier that we can track things. I mean, believe it or not, there's so much. If you're listening to the show and we're watching the show, there's a lot of tracking of you going on that you don't even realize. And
and one of the things as well, I mean, having my iPhone in front of me, I think I've got the iPhone 13. When I first got it and I heard that Apple were clamping down on a lot of the sort of the Facebook tracking, I followed a YouTube video, and I kid you not, it was a 20-minute YouTube video telling me how to turn all the tracking off my phone and what to do. And there must have been 20 different things. I mean, and again, this is where the mindset is right. We've got to understand our phones are tracking us more than we can ever imagine. My Alexa, I've got a Hewlett-Packard printer that is connected via my Wi-Fi, and I've never purchased printer cartridges before from Amazon. And then one day Alexa came up and said, "Simon, your HP cartridges are low. We've added these printer cartridges to your cart. Do you want to buy them?" My wife said, "How did it know?" I said, "Because through the internet, through the Wi-Fi is tracking all this stuff." So we across the world, we always have to understand as individuals that we're being tracked extensively without our, we'll say not without our knowledge, with our knowledge, but we're mostly more liberal. We don't have a great understanding as to what we're being tracked. But when my printer is telling me, or when my Alexa is telling me that you need new cartridges and it's not connected, I mean, that's a problem. That is a problem.
It is. And so I want to move forward because we can talk about law enforcement all day long, but I don't want to tune people out. So you came to America and you started your security company, or you went to work for the Mall of America first?
Yeah, correct. So I was at the Mall of America, and being very honest, capital market, a lot of people were coming to me for advice and support. And it was then that I sort of started Kingswood Security Consulting, because I realized that there was a need for what I was doing, and it was getting sort of bigger than just me. And I sort of started to develop a team of consultants that worked for me. So that's when I sort of created my company. But
just briefly on the Mall of America, I couldn't imagine a more stressful job having to protect that massive target. And I couldn't imagine, because it's a city unto itself.
Yes, you're right. And it actually has its own zip code. I mean, it stands at just short of 6 million square feet. You know, there's 2 hotels there now. There's a theme park inside. It has its own zip code. It has like 42 million visitors a year. It's bigger than Disney because it's free to get in. You know, it's little known fact. It's actually one of the US's top tourist attractions. But here's the weird thing. For me, it was fun. I mean, I was there 3 and a bit years. It was fun, and I think the type of work that we do, you know, being in sort of law enforcement, you know, we understand that there's so much brokenness and so much pain in the world. It was a really fun job. You know, when you're trying to keep people safe, you see a lot of funny things. So stressful, yes, but I think again that's most probably my makeup and my disposition, right? That I sort of attract myself towards these highly stressful environments because that's sort of my DNA as to who I am. But there's a lot of stuff that goes on inside those 4 walls for sure.
And that could be for another show, because I do want to get to your book, Securing
Yes.
Church Operations, which couldn't be more poignant today, considering what happened earlier or later last week, the shooting in Nashville, where it was a church private school. And I mean, everybody watching the show or listening to the show is well aware of the horrific attack and a very good law enforcement response. But one of the things that came out today, and if you're listening to the show or watching the show, it's March 30th. They're talking about how they've seen parts of this person's manifesto, and one of the things that they were concerned with, they were looking at other sites to attack, but they were secure. They had armed officers there, and this one didn't. So we're going to talk about ways that people in religious institutions, because I'm Jewish, I'm not Christian, but you know, we have the same type of things we got to protect for, and this book can be used in both circumstances. You know, I read through it. So what made you write this book and get into church security?
Yeah, it's interesting. So in 2013, I was talking at a sports conference in Disney, and I forget all the American sports. I should remember, but it was like the NBA. Before it was the Major League Soccer, you know, the NFL, Major League Baseball. I was talking to all these different heads of security about how we keep more America secure. And actually my phone rang, and it was from a police department back here in Minnesota where I live. And they said, we're talking to this mega church. They've got 3,000 or 4,000 people that come every weekend. They need help with some security. You know, we know you're a security guy. We know you're a Christian. Can you go and help them? I was thinking, well, I can do, but what does the church need with my skills? And I went there one Wednesday evening and really realized that there was a real need for sort of biblically based security risk management. They needed help to understand from their biblical perspective, how do they keep their open door environment safe? And you know, from then, the sort of Lord really put on my heart to sort of help his churches. And, you know, tying into my story that I mentioned earlier about going out without a father and having some validation issues, it really said to me, Simon, now this is your purpose. Everything that I've given you, all the skills and attributes I've given you to now, this is what it's for, is to sort of help churches. And since that day, I've been on a mission to help sort of churches in America stay safe and secure. And I've touched thousands of churches across the US. So that's how I really got into sort of church safety and security. And I wrote that book, Securing Church Operations, really because I was helping churches and I was finding out that things I was teaching them weren't really working. And I'm a sort of guy of great reflection. I reflected on who I am and how I was teaching. I realized that they really didn't need consultative advice. They needed a program, they needed a structure to follow. And that's how I came up with the 7 steps within the book, sort of to give houses of worship a framework to be, not to be safe, but to be safer by taking these 7 steps.
So what I want to do is talk about not all 7 of them, because then people won't get your book, but I want to I picked out a couple of them, and if you could just expand on what your thoughts are. So the first one is setting up a safety committee. What's a safety committee?
So what the reason why I talk about having a safety committee is most houses of worship across the country, if anyone's listening to this that is religious, they'll definitely resonate with this, is that most often it's one person or it's a volunteer or it could be a member of staff, and they're trying to change culture that, we're an open door, everyone is welcome, to try and implement some type of security. And we often try and solve problems on our own. And even me and my team, I'm call myself the chief problem solver, but I have a team behind me. So the reason why I recommend that you have a safety team, and every organisation should really have this sort of safety committee, or now maybe it's like / threat assessment team, is to have a group of individuals where you can bounce ideas off, you can discuss problems, and then work out, well, what is the best solution for our church? What should we be doing to move forward? I've been getting a lot of calls this week from houses of work, some even in Nashville, saying, what should we be doing now? And I often say to them is, don't take this problem alone, because you'll never be able to, to really get ahead. You've got to get a group of people where you can talk, you can reflect and say, what is the best thing to do within the culture of our organisation to move forward, and do that with numbers so you have support. Because one of the single reasons that I find programs fail is that people are overwhelmed, they're stressed, and when I look behind, is because most often they're trying to lead the security charge on their own. When I was at Mall of America, I had 30, 40 people behind me. I was just a figurehead, so people might look and say, well, Simon did this. No, Simon didn't do this. My team were doing this behind. So I really advocate for houses of worship having a safety committee or having a threat assessment team so you can work through problems together.
And who should be on this team?
Well, ideally, if you have someone from your leadership team, be that sort of C-suite, executive pastor, depending on your faith denomination or religious leader, and then try and find a mixed group of people. I mean, the type of places or type of people that house of worship serve, mental illness, human brokenness, so just think of some outreach programs. So ideally, a religious leader, it could be someone of our background who might have law enforcement background. Find someone in your community who might specialize or work in mental illness, someone within outreach. Really find this multidisciplinary team of a variety of backgrounds. So when you're looking at a problem, someone can say, oh yeah, but that's good, Simon, but you didn't think about this. So just having a multidisciplinary team will really help you get a wide perspective of a problem that you can then sort of work through together and find the best solution for your church.
And now another one is protecting the perimeter, which kind of goes into what I said earlier, that they secured those facilities by having armed guards. So what is protecting the perimeter?
Yes, so physical security 101 is protection of your perimeter. Now, the type of podcast that you have, I'm pretty sure that 99.9% of your listeners know protection of perimeter. They're locking their cars at night, they're locking their house, and they're making sure their windows and everything is secure. Protection of your perimeter in sort of a biblical sense and house of worship is really getting them to explore the church open door that you often hear, and you have this in synagogues as well. All faith denominations have this, but we're an open and welcome environment, so we want to leave our doors open so people feel welcomed. Well, that is the case, and when I say to house of worship is, what does open door mean to you? And then can we try and put some security measures in place? I work with one of the largest churches in the country. They have 12 campuses. They're a $50 million nonprofit. To get in one of their churches during the week, you have to press a button. It goes to a camera. Someone talks to you, finds out why you're there, and then they determine if they let you in. They would say, and I would agree, that we're an open door church. But there's some churches that consider that, well, we need to have our doors open to become an open door. So protection of your perimeter is really getting house of worship to understand that physical security 101 is protection of your perimeter. Once your perimeter has been breached, it is very difficult then to keep harm at bay. And when we saw that at the Covenant school in Nashville, where the assailant shot through the glass. And I think within 12 seconds, the assailant was inside the school. So protection of your perimeter for anyone listening in the house of worship that is physical security 101. We've got to find ways to keep harm out. And the best thing to do in the church is to greet people, welcome, to look them in the eyes, try and find out why they're there, and just do a basic human risk assessment that we all have. We all have hairs that stand up on the back of our hands when things don't go right. Our mouth gets dry and clammy when we feel nervous, and we have to listen to what's our body trying to communicate to us in that moment. And then we can do an assessment of a human that's walking in and make a judgment. We're not judging anyone. We were given instincts for a reason. So all these things around protection of your perimeter, because if your perimeter is breached, it's very difficult to keep harm at bay.
So you have a $50 million nonprofit church. What do you tell the people who have, a very small church that doesn't have a camera set up with a control access?
Great question.
How do you solve that problem?
Great question. So this is a mindset as well. So I'm a security practitioner who primarily focuses in the safe space, but this is most of what I teach. It isn't necessarily security, it's culture and mindset. What I say to them is, if you have 5, 6, 7, 8 doors, which you want to keep open because you want someone to walk in because it's an open door church, but is it not better if you have 7 entrances, is it not better to close 6 of your entrances so people can get out? We're not talking about blocking fire escapes, so people can get out, but you funnel all foot traffic past your one entrance. And then when someone comes in, you have an usher, a greeter, or you can have an admin person during the week who reaches out their hand and says, "Welcome to our church. My name's Simon. I'm the administrator here. What brings you here today?" And we have a conversation. That way, you know and understand who's in your building. And ideally, you want to train that person on threat assessment. But if you can't, they have their human instinct that they've been given. And then they can do that threat assessment for you. So you don't necessarily need technology. You need to sort of shift your mindset to say, okay, well, yes, we've got all these entrances. It is church open door. But we also want people to feel welcomed when they walk in. So closing some of our entrances down so they have to see a member of staff who can welcome them, tell them about programs and can engage. That's actually doing the work of your faith denomination, is being the person in the community. So there's always different ways to look at this outside of technology and finance. Just allowing a human to do that threat assessment for you and greet every person that comes in, because that's the mission of the church, to bring those in the community to their faith denomination. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I want to get your opinion on this. So where I'm at, we have armed security, visible armed security, and then on certain events we also hire police details. And it's just part of your membership fee. There's a security fee to pay for all this. But at least from somebody coming by, they're going to have to get through that initially in order to get inside to where people are praying or where the school is.
Yes, and most of these incidents, and I believe we saw this again in Nashville, even though I'm not talking out of turn, I'm sure I read an article on this, is that the assailant parked in the parking lot and then walked into the school with their firearms. So again, wherever you can get to widen your perimeter to be able to see who's coming inside your building. And again, I don't want to maybe I shouldn't say this, but I feel it's most pretty valid to say is that if we see the danger in the parking lot, it gives us the opportunity to lock our doors and try and keep people safe. We're more challenged in a school, we're more challenged in a church because of resources and the mission. And it's very easy to say, well, you can monitor your parking lot. Not many organizations monitor their parking lot 24/7, but the wider you can get the assailant most of these cases, the person has displayed their firearm before they've actually got into the building. So it gives you the ability to lock your door. So I think you're right. Having law enforcement, if you can afford them, stationed at your door, or have people that are your defenders that would step in if needs be.
What is safety training?
So safety training is looking at the problems that you most often have in house of worship. So a lot of people, we and I think I sort of said this earlier, that we default to active violence, and there's been over 180 mass shootings in the US since 1966. But we have around 17,000 gun crimes a year in the US. So high impact, but actually low probability. To assure anyone listening to this, we're actually pretty safe in our schools, in our churches, against an active assailant, because it's very low probability. So safety training is looking at, well, what are the problems that we most often face? Number one is a medical. Number two is around de-escalation arguments. So when we look at safety training, we're looking at, well, what is most likely to occur in our church? Someone faints, someone has a heart attack, someone slip and falls. Okay, so we can train for that. We can do CPR. We might want to have somebody just stop the bleed. We might want to find out if there's an EMT within our community. And let's give some awareness and training around that, because that's most likely. Well, what if there's a husband or wife arguing in our parking lot, or someone's distressed, someone's lost a child and they're distressed and in a terrible circumstance? Well, there's some skills that we can teach people around that. So let's teach them conflict de-escalation skills. Which is very common, that someone might come into a church and protest the scripture that is being spoken about. Someone might want to argue with the pastor. Well, how are we going to stop that incident from occurring? In the moment, we're not going to unpack 10 years of mental illness. We're not going to unpack that person's anger and that pain, because they've already disrupted the service because they're shouting. So if we need to remove that person physically and minister to them later, what does that look like? Well, we need some type of physical defense, personal defense training. So safety training is really identifying that, well, what could go wrong in our environment? What is most likely? And then making sure that you've trained your individuals to be able to respond. Because most people in life, they'll say, I'll step in and I'll go first, but tell me what it is that you expect me to do and give me the training. So safety training is really identifying what is most likely and then offering that training to individuals within your house of worship.
Yeah, because a lot of times when people think of a safety committee, first thing that comes to mind is that, you're the guy that's going to be carrying the gun or whatever. You're going to go hands-on. But you're right. I mean, that's once in a lifetime event, at least.
Yeah.
Hopefully not, but that could be a once in a lifetime event, versus medical issues are going to happen all the time. Custody disputes, especially if there's a school, it's going to happen all the time. And what are your protocols to deal with that? Who's going to deal with that? And I think a lot of times people fail. People definitely fail because they don't have a plan.
And you do get a lot of pastors that say, well, if that ever happens, I'll minister to the person. I do say in the days of crisis intervention, you're not going to unpack 20 years of mental illness, someone who's schizophrenic and off their medication who are shouting you. It's maybe not best to do it from the front of a church, because that could be an hour back and forth conversation. You've got to think about, we need to get them out first, then we'll minister to them second, because, I hate that ministers think this, but some of them maybe have a sort of misconception as to what that situation is going to look like. You can't unpack all that hurt and pain in 2 or 5 minutes. You're remiss if you think you can,
This is an interesting question that just came into my mind. Do you ever have ministers or not, I don't say priests, because I don't think priests would, but do you ever, I would say ministers, carry guns? Because everyone's facing them. They're going to be the first person to see someone get up and do something, versus someone who's like sitting down or at the back. They're not going to see it.
Yeah, and I do. And it's really interesting, because there's normally in life you get a grey area, and I don't think I see much grey in this. Normally the ministers are Honestly, they're in denial that it's never going to happen here, or God will protect us. Well, depending on your faith denomination, your higher power, most higher powers don't promise that. Or there's the extreme that they recognise the danger and they do carry in the pulpit. I mean, I can, as you were saying that question, I can think of 9 or 10 ministers that come to mind that actually preach and they're carrying a firearm. But I don't see many in the middle. It's normally our higher power, our God will protect us against, yes, I do carry one in the pulpit to keep people safe.
Yeah, that's interesting. And lastly, what's the worship attack cycle?
So the worship attack cycle is really based off the sort of criminal attack cycle, the terrorist attack cycle. And we saw it within the attack in Nashville, is that these assailants, they don't just snap. They don't just wake up one morning and say that I'm going to go to a school and I'm going to take some human life, or I'm going to go to a weeknight Bible study at a prominent African church in South Carolina, and I'm going to sort of take some human life. I think it's widely accepted now they don't do that, and they go through this cycle of planning. They prepare. We talk about the Charleston mass murderer, where a 21-year-old walked in on a Wednesday night Bible study and took 9 lives, including the pastor. That 21-year-old didn't even have a firearm. He had to go and buy a firearm to carry out his attack. So they always go through this cycle, and we're seeing it now within the Nashville shooting, but they have to plan and they have to prepare. In the Nashville shooting, the chief of police has been very transparent, saying that in the manifesto, in all the details were found how planned this was, that this certain individual had maps of the security cameras and had everything mapped out as to where things were. He's been very open about that. Well, that person didn't find that on the internet, but she didn't go to a security integrator and steal the information. It tends to suggest that that person had been inside that environment very recently and was in a position to map all this out. So we see that these assailants go through this cycle, that they get fixated on their targets. They will start planning their attack. They will go and rehearse their attack. They will carry out some type of pre-surveillance to know what environment they're walking into. They may even rehearse their attack and then actually go and carry out their attack. So in a lot of these active violence situations, we're seeing that people are going through this cycle. What we have to understand at House of Worship is that we can't see if this person is planning the attack. We don't know they just purchased a firearm. What we do see is when they come into our school, our House of Worship, and conduct surveillance, most often in plain sight. And we might see if they're testing our procedures, taking cameras, asking unusual questions, being in our House of Worship for an extended period of time, being out of place, being found in restricted areas. We will see those behaviours, and when we see them, we need to have some type of knowledge or understanding that could be a person who's in that worship attack cycle, meaning that some type of harm might be carried out against us. I'm pretty confident on what I've read already on Nashville that assailant went through that cycle, because, like I said, the fact they had a map with all the surveillance cameras and security on, either them or someone else had been inside that building recently to map all this out. Why were they there? Some type of cover story, some type of false explanation, but the circumstances saying to me the only way they could really know that information is if they or someone else went in there with a purpose to conduct surveillance.
So, and you don't have to answer this question, but
I will. Yeah.
The first thing you did when you moved to America, did you go out and buy a firearm?
It wasn't the first thing, but I do have in my gun safe up in my office, I've got an AR 22, an M&P 9mm, and a shotgun. So I guess I've now got four firearms. So I've actually embraced it. For me, it's pretty fun. I enjoy it. It is a lot of fun. And even my eldest son is 12. He hasn't come recently, but he'll come to the range and he'll fire the AR, which for me, as a father and a responsible firearms owner, is that I know that my 12-year-old, if needs to, I can say, here's the combination to my gun safe. Go in there, remove the AR, load the AR, and then go and defend the family. Now, I hope that my 12-year-old never needs to do that, but I have conditioned him to go through those steps. The only thing he doesn't know is the code to get into the safe. So I'm a very, I've embraced the firearms, and I've taught those around me to be responsible, because we live in very troubled times where you may be called to defend yourself, and I want to make sure that my two sons are able to do that. I pray they never do, but they have the skills to do it if needed.
Well, I think that's terrific, and I think that's a great way to put it all together. So Simon, you wrote this book, and I'll link it down below for everybody. It's called Securing Church Operations. It's not that big of a book if people are, they forgot how to read since they're just scrolling on their phones all the time.
It's written for men, so it's a short airport read. So I wrote it with men in mind. Short content, short attention spans.
Yes, and if people want to follow you and to learn or even to hire you, what's the best way about reaching out to you?
Yeah, thank you. So my website is kingswoodsc.com, kingswoodsc.com. And if you have any questions, commentary, even about some of the things I've spoken about today, the best way is to get to me through my team. You can go to team@kingswoodsc.com, team@kingswoodsc.com. My assistant is very good at telling me all the messages that come in. So I would welcome any conversation on anything I've spoken about today, or any of their own views and opinions on some of the things that we've discussed.
Yes, and if religion's in your life and this is important to you, and you want to protect wherever you go to worship, this is important stuff. So I'm very happy to have had you on the show and speak to the people, my friends out here in the Firearms Nation.
Well, before we end, you should call me mate, right? Just to be
right, mate.
There you go.
Absolutely. Well, cheers, mate. And
I was going to say, it's been an honor and a privilege to talk to you. I really enjoyed the conversation. We've covered a lot of stuff, but I hope that your listeners are stuck with it, because there's been some useful things in there for them.
Tally ho. Or is it cheerio? What is
it? Cheerio, you could say. Cheerio.
Cheerio, mate. Cheerio, I think is what pirates say. But anyways, thank you very much.